Let's go to the other issue there for the government, this National Anti-Corruption Commission. We saw on Friday, as people pick their way through the legislation, we find out that there'll be the potential use of the tapping of phones of senior bureaucrats and politicians without a warrant. Now, that's a huge issue, and I'll come to that in a moment with my next guest. But also Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney-General, admitting that even messaging apps like WhatsApp and Signal could be accessed. Let's have a listen.
What if they're using encrypted apps, WhatsApp, Signal and so on? A lot of politicians, when they call or text, like to use these. Can they be tapped?
Interception is available, and the Commission will have the same powers available to it, subject to warrant, that the police and our intelligence agencies have, and that's appropriate.
It can do what ASIO can do, and
subject to warrant.
And tap encrypted apps.
Subject to warrant. It can seek to intercept telecommunications.
Joining me now, former Assistant Attorney-General and Senator for Queensland, Amanda Stoker. Amanda, I've no issue with getting access to someone's encrypted messages, their WhatsApp or anything else on their phone, provided we stick to the warrant process. But in the detail of this legislation is a move away from a warrant process and a lot of arbitration being left on the desk of the Attorney-General, who is the Attorney-General, sure, but ultimately, in Mark Dreyfus and all Attorney-Generals, an MP from a political party. This issue of a warrant and how important a warrant is for the citizens' protection. If we walk away from this is a centuries-old provision. This is a big deal.
The importance of a warrant in the criminal justice process is that it stops a person being subject to what could in effect be harassing kind of behaviours in circumstances where there isn't a sufficiently strong basis for prying into that person's materials. Now, a warrant is the protection against that, and so it's really important that anything that a federal anti-corruption body can do is subject to warrant. It needs to be. Now, the issue of those warrants should be done by an independent body. You don't want that being done by an Attorney-General or any other political actor, because that means the process becomes potentially subject to political abuse. And quite frankly, the fact that we need to have this conversation is just proof of why the right place for this to be dealt with is actually with the police, who would be dealing with it at the present time.
What about Julie and Lisa picking up today that it's in the legislation, but it's not in the explanatory memorandum? So for people at home, that's the accompanying paperwork that helps you understand the placement of the clauses in the legislation as it is drafted. It helps you understand the bill. Well, it's not mentioned in the EM, this carve-out for unions, but Julie and Lisa found that their Section 12, I think it was, in the actual legislation. So a carve-out for unions, but then there's a risk that journalists would have to reveal sources.
Yeah, I am really troubled by the way that this has been crafted, and in many ways it looks as though it's been kept deliberately vague so that there's enough wiggle room for it to be expanded into all kinds of places that, quite frankly, would trouble Australians if they knew. We only need to look at the New South Wales example to see the dangers that come from a loose or open to interpretation structure. The New South Wales ICAC has misunderstood and overreached out of its powers because of what it said was uncertainty. It has been given the power, I think, quite abhorrently and in a way that is due to be also the case in the federal legislation, to not just inquire to what has in fact been conduct that is corrupt, but stuff that could potentially be corrupt. It's like being able to look into and string somebody up for something they might do rather than something that they have done. And that is a really, really red line issue when it comes to the criminal justice system. And I'd really hate to see circumstances where reputations and livelihoods go down the drain over something that isn't more than speculative.
Well, over the weekend, you were one of the headline acts at CPAC in Sydney. I'm told you were incredibly popular. For those who weren't there, I want to play a little bit of what you had to say.
Equally responsible was too many Liberals' willingness to just go along with cultural movements that they didn't truly believe in because they weren't willing to take on the zeitgeist. They were too afraid of being called a nasty name to speak up. For some, may be unable to articulate why it is they believe what they do. But here's the thing. When you don't show up and make the case, you lose by default.
So I couldn't agree more than with what you had to say, and I reckon I've said that most nights here on the show, particularly during the election campaign. You know, get into the ring, into these cultural fights, fight for values, you know, not just tax policy and all the other things that the Morrison government was banging on. You, though, were a member of the government. Couldn't you get your colleagues to see sense?
Look, there was a real reluctance to do anything other than focus on the economy. And while the economy is really, really important, it's important only to the extent that it enables people to reach their hopes and dreams. And so we need to understand what those things are and speak in the language of people's greatest hopes and dreams. But when they lie on their deathbed at the end of their life, they're not saying, oh, I wish I had participated in the economy more, although it's important. They're going to talk about the relationships that matter and the ambitions they achieved. And so it's really important we hook into the way that culture affects Australians' deepest aspirations. We don't get that if we just say, oh, politics is downstream from culture and opt out of the hard arguments.
Beautifully said, Amanda Stoker. We're going to get you back in the ring, back in Parliament. Thank you for your time.